And I'll just briefly let you know that the problematic that opened our seminar had to do with the question of whether one can ever be nonviolent. And we noted that people who are nonviolent or wish to be involved in a practice of nonviolence usually make certain qualifications or exceptions, saying, I am nonviolent, but if someone attacked my child, I would kill them, or I would attack back, or if someone attacked my dog, or my loved one, or people who are like me, or speak my language, or belong to my faith, or my nation state, or whatever. And the question is always where that line is drawn. Like, whose lives would I defend violently, and whose lives would I fail to defend violently? And does that not put us in an odd situation of deciding among lives we would fight to protect and those we would not? But also, there seems to be a kind of psychoanalytic question, which is, can we ever not be violent? In other words, if we think about nonviolence as a prohibition on the expression of aggression as violence, using aggression as a more kind of psychic disposition or drive, and understanding violence as one of its possible enactments. If we are engaged in the act of prohibition, are we not always engaged in recruiting and circuiting aggression against ourselves, and could that be understood as a certain kind of perpetration of violence on the self? Can we speak that way? Ought we to speak that way? My suggestion this morning was that perhaps we could stop ourselves from acting violently, but we could never become fully nonviolent beings if what we meant by that was getting rid of all of our aggression or will to violence or whatever we might express it. One question we're trying to raise, and I think we'll probably get there more tomorrow, is whether we can think about nonviolence outside of the discourse of prohibition or the logics of prohibition, or whether we need prohibitions, and to pay the price, which apparently is a rather hefty one according to Freud. And this morning we looked at the Rome analogy, famous Rome analogy, had a very good time with that, I think, and realized that we were not narcissists without limit, and that made us kind of sad. That the external world frustrates our desire. Something called a reality principle makes it really rough to be omnipotent and narcissistic without limit. We noted that there's a nice narcotic hit that we can get from art and maybe religion. Falling in love also has a narcotic pull. But that
don't start.
but that in general life as we find it is too hard for us. Okay.
That's very true.
Yeah. So the line on which we ended was, we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love. And we speculated perhaps that this defenselessness that comes up in love is linked to infantile helplessness, but also maybe that oceanic feeling that is prior to individuation. Love here might be understood as a kind of temporary suspension of the boundary of the ego, and a readmitting of that boundarylessness that we can't really return to in any direct way, either through theoretical language or pictorial or figurative language. I mean, you can try, but it can't be recovered or captured in that way. So what we're trying to do is move toward the final two chapters of this book, which really do, I think, engage us in the problem of prohibition and guilt, the institution of the superego and its various pleasures and unpleasures. But I thought perhaps I might just say a few things about the intervening chapters, and then we could turn to it. I know, I'm recruiting you to talk about an unhappy thing.
No, not at all. Shall I respond to what you just said,
Yeah.
or are you
No,
on
that
a
would
roll?
be just terrific. I'm hardly on a roll. I'm exhausted.
I'm delighted to be here. It's a guilty pleasure. And you are so lucky, as you know, all of you, that you're being led through this tremendous labyrinth of complications and desires by our Larry Rickles once said, "Take me to your reader," by one of our great leaders. So thank you for inviting me to this effort and to this reflection that is more important today than ever. I'd like to say a few words in response to what was just said, and begin maybe the way Freud begins the 8th chapter of the Unbehagen, or the civilization and its discontent, by a detour or an off-ramp. It's very important, of course, when Freud says, I had to take detours. And if you are going to read bifocally with Heidegger, for example, infinitely non-reciprocal text, who takes pathways, but his are Holzwege, in other words, paths that lead nowhere. So you have a kind of sense of the broken path that both Freud and Heidegger share, but part ways on. I think that's a reference to a recent book by Judith Butler. The very indication of the frayed path, or where you must part ways, is something not to be perhaps ignored, because what does it even mean to proceed by detour? So I'd like to take an off-ramp in that spirit of jammed GPS. And this in itself, taking a detour, means I'm not going to go Aristotelian on you. We don't have a telos. We don't have an end goal, though we all wish nonviolence were possible. And by the way, this is one of the most pessimistic texts, and this is when Freud is beginning to lose heart and lose hope. And there's something, if you can imagine that Judith Butler is bringing to you one of the most radical and revolutionary texts that says, we are not built for peace, or we can't really handle peaceful coexistence. Coexistence is already aggressive. The co is a real problem. And one of the political, philosophical points that he scores, and what you were suggesting too, is that somehow we, I use this loosely, but just to move a little, need to make the leap from narcissism to the ability to identify with the other and stop just the narcissistic lockdown and getting off on oneself. Can one get off in the other sense of getting away from oneself and throwing a cable to the other so that there would be a communitarian kind of breach in narcissism? And Freud is not saying we can do that. We may not be able to make the jump from it, which would be necessary for a just politics, if that's even imaginable in this text. So my off-ramp would be to much too quickly take a detour so that I can come back to some of the itineraries that are being proposed here, just in order to offer a supplementary and perhaps overburdening provocation already, to think in terms of the scandalous moment when Derrida, reading Levinas, points out that Levinas says that the other wants at times to be violated. That sounds wrong. It sounds scandalous. And yet, for the other to be, and in Heideggerian, this would be on the level maybe of the Stoß or the prod, that one needs a prod or a little stimulation, which is always violating, crossing a line, in order to somehow come to life in a certain way. This is something, I'm just doing a sidebar off-ramp to say, if you took a course through these texts that I just mentioned, and those moments where a violation or being shaken awake by the other, which is a violence, that the other slaps you into life. And this brings up a kind of libidinal surge. And as Kant says in the Perpetual Peace Treaty, real peace and nonviolence would mean the cemetery. So there's something that we loosely resist about peacefulness. And we want to be, maybe, again, too quickly said, big abbreviations here. Each one of these statements require years of archival enslavement, which I have a certificate to prove I've accomplished, and I'm doing still. So the thing when the other kind of gets up in your face, we think that's negative, but there's something also of a thrill that and the course I would suggest, just to provoke our wishes, and what Freud here says in the 8th chapter, that our ideals are a little diluted when we think that nonviolence is even what we desire. Can one even, is that syntagm and that grammar possible, to desire nonviolence? Once there's desire, there's violence. Can you desire nonviolence? Can you want it? Wanting is already part of a violent kind of reverberation. I'm suggesting hypothetically off-ramped here. So the other name that you would want to bring into the ring here would be that of Bataille, right? And the tears of Eros and the erotic kind of shakedowns that he's so capable of. And the kind of rendezvous of violence and a certain supplement of joy and pleasure. So that would be, does this mess everything up and bore the shit out of you?
No, it's a great provocation.
Oh, okay.
May I say two things in rejoinder?
Sure.
Okay. So first of all, try.
He said I was your own Tony Soprano. Yeah, give it a try.
The idea of the troublesome detour that starts chapter 8, in some ways recalls the opening chapter when he begins to talk about Rome and offer it as an analogy to the human psyche and to the unconscious in particular. And he keeps on claiming that he has, of course, taken a detour and gone off the way. He's gone off the path, effectively. He apologizes, but then continues, which I think is very interesting. And the text seems to vacillate between announcing that that was a detour and apologizing, asking for forgiveness from himself, really,
Right.
and then relaunching on the detour. Now, one thing that occurs to me here is that in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he does say, in describing the death drive, that one way to understand it is to think of life as a circuitous path toward death. Right. So much of his writing actually enacts this circuitous path, and which then raises the question of the linguistic status or the linguistic operation of the death drive. Right? How do we think about it as part of this writing? Why is it that non-teleological thinking and non-systematic procedure seem to belong to the linguistic operation of the death drive? It's an open question that I have there.
Also the uncanny, remember, he keeps on returning, he can't get on a path.
Yes, he can't, he is compulsively repeating.
Right.
Yeah. So, so there's that, which I think is really interesting. I think what's complicated for us is that it's clear that Freud understands Beyond the Pleasure Principle to be a break with the pleasure principle, and from the idea that wish fulfillment or fully organizes psychic process. Something comes up that calls that into question, and a good 25 years of his work sort of, I'm sorry, I laugh every time that happens, but that edifice starts to fall. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's literally a decomposition of the edifice of his work that operates when the death drive comes up. And he notes that there are these forms of repetition compulsion that are not pleasurable, that don't serve a wish, and that can't be understood as forms of wish fulfillment. And war trauma comes up, and other kinds of traumatic materials as well. But then toward the end of that book, it's also clear that sexuality can be recruited by the death drive, and it can become an instrument of the death drive, at which point we're back into the question of excitation, which is what you bring up. So when you say there may not be pleasure without violence, or there may not be pleasure that's separate from what we could call the death drive, or its, what he comes to call its main representative aggression, it seems that it's not just that we leave pleasure for the death drive, but that pleasure then gets reinstituted as part of the operation of the death drive, which is why queer theorists like Bersani and Edelman can say that the death drive is actually extremely important for the contestation of the social regulation of sexuality, for instance, or why Bersani would say that the death drive is what produces an excitation that keeps us from a living death, oddly enough. In other words, the death drive keeps us from living the equivalent of the cemetery, even though, of course, it leads us there. And that's very paradoxical and very, very interesting. And I think hard to get, hard to understand. But I think that's where if I'm reading you right, that's where your intervention, not necessarily through queer theory, would want to recruit you.
Sure, but not through Bersani.
Not through Bersani, okay, not through Bersani, no. I mean, but you can understand how he gets there, kind of.
I hope he gets there.
Okay, wrong path.
No, absolutely, that's, I wanted to say something that, unless you're still responding, that we could maybe put on our menu for today's discussion, because the 8th chapter also involves punishment. and you've referred to that already, and the so-called need for punishment. One example is that of Dostoevsky, that Freud points us toward. Freud was asked to write an introduction to a book on Dostoevsky. It was hard for him to do because he doesn't like Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky was very right-wing, very, very disappointing for a man of great insight and beautiful work. He was just totally into the Tsar and so on and so forth, anti-Semitic, which Freud does not mention, by the way. But he's also considered to have raped some girls. I mean, he has a nasty rap sheet, Dostoevsky. But that's not where Freud is disappointed in him. He's disappointed in him in the failure to man up politically in certain ways. But the point that I wanted to make was that Dostoevsky was famously an epileptic and had lots of crises and was always on the brink of his own body's destruction. And you may know that he was arrested and he was about to be executed. And he was in front of the firing squad when he was suddenly reprieved. So it was very close to the end for Dostoevsky. He was about to be executed, really. It was almost like a film where the phone suddenly rings. And the execution was stayed. And then he was only exiled to Siberia, which is a punishment. At that time, Dostoevsky stopped having any of his symptoms, and his epileptic fits absolutely subsided. He was in the blossom of health. Or he was absolutely thriving. So Freud uses this as an example for someone who was psychically and somatically very distressed and unwell until the moment where he was set up by the state to be brutally punished. And somehow that delivery of, not from punishment, but of punishment, calmed him down totally. So Freud at this moment says, you need to be very aware of those who come, as in a grade B movie. Do you remember, or have you ever seen any? I like to watch them, where someone runs up to the judge and said, I did it, I killed her. She laughed at me, I couldn't stand it, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's another problem. But the one who rushes up and turns herself or himself into the authorities to say, I did it, please punish me. That's a syntagm that is in popular films and so on. Freud says, be very careful, because people will rush up and say, punish me, I did it. And our stupid penal system, of which is so excessive in the United States of America that it's just shameful, takes that as a legally binding, admission or confession, right? I did it. That's all you need to get in trouble. So Freud says, could we have a permanent sidebar installed here, please? And note that many people will rush up and turn themselves in for punishment.
And what do you make of it? What's the yield of confessing to punishment?
That's a great question. Well, when I confess to punishment, there's a kind of lightening up of there's a magnetizing of all sorts of maybe stray shots of guilty, destructive burdens, so that, as Freud says in the case of the rat man of obsessional neuroses, which is very close to what he says at the end of this text, the neurotic need to be guilty, the excess of guilt as a neurotic symptom, right? What did I want to say? That the need, the yield is, that very often you have to strike with the arbitrariness of the police force when they arrest anyone just to stop everyone from panicking. Doesn't matter if that person is guilty or not, just arrest them, put them away, and everyone calms down. And that's how psychoanalysts go after certain symptoms. Just tell people, this is your problem, and they're like, ah. Whether or not it's true, doesn't matter a shit, says Freud.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So in this case, I don't know if it's that kind of mobilization and metonymy of it doesn't matter what I confess to, I know I'm guilty, I know I deserve to get the crap beaten out of me, and everything suddenly is clean slated.
Yes. Well, it may actually have to do with quelling anxiety, which is
yeah.
in some sense also the deflected version of a guilt that may not know what it's guilty for, right? A kind of free-floating guilt of some kind or another. It's like, oh, thank God I found a crime. And,
right.
And Freud has that very interesting short piece called on the Pale Criminal, where he actually does talk. It's one of the few places where he cites Nietzsche, and
yeah.
And he talks about how guilt precedes the crime, that the crime can very often be committed from a sense of guilt, because guilt needs to find its reason for being.
It's like a search engine.
It's like a search engine.
Find me a crime, I'll
Find
do
me a
it.
crime, exactly. Which raises the question of what is this seemingly this circulating guilt that can't find its object and produces its deed as a kind of satisfaction of that. So yes, great. I also wonder if this could lead us to talk a little bit about masochism in Freud, but let's do a little bit of a build up to those chapters, and then I'll quit being so didactic.
No, but I don't want to. I mean, there's something about following the impulse of a detour.
Yes, that's the problem. How do you teach a text that
right.
is nothing but a set of detours? It's like I'm really working overtime over here.
Yeah, and then you don't want to capsize and derail totally.
Right,
and
but there's no way not to.
Okay, but I'm already feeling guilty. Did I already mess up?
Oh, you have really messed up everything, girlfriend.
That's what I feel.
You're
contracted.
Sorry, I did.
Siberia for you.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, get us back on track.
No, there is no track. Okay, let me just say a few things, because I have an academic superego that
like I don't?
You so do.
Okay.
You are my academic superego.
Okay.
Whoa. Actually, you and Larry both, and I'm really sad he's not here.
See, I got a discount, so.
Yeah. All right. There are a couple of things I just want to say. One is simply that Freud tries to give us some account of why there is this suffering that goes along with human life that we can't really stop or do much about. There's the suffering that we undergo as bodies. There are what he calls weak social regulations, and he refers even at one point to a piece of unconquerable nature that he associates with the death drive. And here again, the death drive seems to undercut or undo social bonds or relations or even human constructions like art forms. He refers as well to what he calls the circularity of civilization. And that's on page 58 of my English text, which is interesting. He writes, when we start considering that there might be this piece of unconquerable nature that is part of our own psychical constitution, when we start considering this possibility, we come upon a contention which is so astonishing that we must dwell upon it. This contention holds that what we call our civilization is largely responsible for our misery, and that we should be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. I want us to kind of remember that the term primitive here kind of associates in a complicated way with early psychic states, but also with certain kinds of bad anthropological claims. But remember that the most primitive condition would be the de-individuated state. It would be the inanimate condition toward which the death drive itself tends to bring us. I call this contention astonishing because in whatever way we may define the concept of civilization, it is a certain fact that all the things with which we seek to protect ourselves against the threats that emanate from the sources of suffering are part of that very civilization. In other words, we turn to civilization to protect ourselves against suffering, only to find that civilization is itself the source of much, if not all, of our suffering. That's the circularity of civilization, and it seems to be a circularity from which we cannot exactly break out, or at least not in this text. It would be interesting to see if you see a way of breaking out of that circularity in this text. He does sometimes go into moments of wondering whether primitive man is better off. There's some echoes of Rousseau in this text. But interestingly enough, he saves a fair amount of anger for the idea of Christian love. And that comes out in 81 of this text. And some other places as well.
Which Lacan will pick up on.
Indeed,
Very strong.
for Lacan, it's extremely important. And I'm not going to find this immediately.
It's also in the 8th chapter.
It's also in the
turns back to.
Yes. I mean, one thing he obviously says is that the universal love of mankind doesn't discriminate among those that we love. It makes love into an indiscriminate thing, that demeans love and also doesn't acknowledge that there are people who are simply not worthy of love. One of his claims. He also claims that.
Can I do an off-ramp, or you could
Yeah,
just
go
shut
ahead.
me off?
Go ahead.
One could think of the United States of America and the promiscuity, the Christian promiscuity of the love that gets professed at every moment. If you think of actors and so on who says, I love you too, or I love you, or this I love you, that is so unstoppably proliferant in the American contemporary history of utterance, is something just to be aware of, that it's also a way of precisely to circle back to the questions that were announced in the beginning of this discussion. It's a way of disavowing the aggression and the rage that's hiding and crouching behind professions of love that are all too promiscuous. And the thought that when Christianity says you should love everyone, how does this turn against itself and turn against love, or turn against the purported addressee of love? And you know, again, in the American rhetoric of love, that when bombs are delivered to enemy territories, they're called love letters, right?
Oh, yeah, it's true.
Here's a love letter
It's true.
for Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a sense of the missive, the missile. There's a whole military zoning.
Loving penetration.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's part of the universal love that America is capable of delivering. And it's something that is not contradictory with this kind of objection in a certain way.
Mhm.
That would open all sorts of dossiers, and I'm not certain that's necessary right now, and maybe it's an illustration that doesn't illustrate enough, or it illustrates too much, but I did want to contribute.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And in fact, I think that one of the concerns Freud has clearly is with the idea of community and the kinds of bonds of community, which are very often not only repress sexuality and so are constantly disrupted by its emergence, but also demand certain kinds of enmities or ways of differentiating itself from others that does presume hostility. So the suppression of hostility within and the suppression of sexuality from within produces sometimes a kind of sexualized aggression outwards, right? Which is exactly what you're talking about.
And the denial of the hostile stance.
Yes.
I love you. Why are you so upset? You know.
Yeah.
It's the abuse.
Did you find the passages?
Yes, I think what I wanted was on 91 of my text, which begins this way. He talks about one of the ideal demands of civilized society, and here he's really targeting Christianity. It runs, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." And that's important for us who are, as we try to think about coexistence, nonviolence. "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." It is known throughout the world and is undoubtedly older than Christianity, interestingly. I wonder what he's thinking. Which puts it forward as its proudest claim, yet it is certainly not very old. Even in historical times, it was still strange to mankind. Let us adopt a naive attitude towards it, as though we were hearing it for the first time. We shall be unable then to suppress a feeling of surprise and bewilderment. Why should we do it? That is to say, love thy neighbor as thyself. What good will it do us? But above all, how shall we achieve it? How can it be possible? My love is something valuable to me, which I ought not to throw away without reflection. It imposes duties on me, for whose fulfillment I must be ready to make sacrifices. If I love someone, he must deserve it in some way. I leave out of account the use he may be to me, and also his possible significance for me as a sexual object, for neither of these two kinds of relationship comes into question where the precept to love my neighbor is concerned. He deserves it if he is so like me in important ways that I can love myself in him, narcissism, and he deserves it.
Which means that the other, can I just say, the other has just been annexed in a way and axed, because if it's yourself that you observe in the other, then the other has been effaced.
There's no alterity there.
Right.
There's no alterity left. That love has destroyed alterity. Right. He deserves it if he is so like me in important ways that I can love myself in him, and he deserves it if he is so much more perfect than myself that I can love my ideal of my own life in him, my own self in him. Again, I have to love him if he is my friend's son, since the pain my friend would feel if any harm came to him would be my pain too. I should have to share it. But if he is if he's a stranger to me, and if he cannot attract me by any worth of his own, or any significance that he may already have acquired for my emotional life, it will be hard for me to love him. Indeed, I should be wrong to do so, for my love is valued by all my own people as a sign of my preferring them, and it is an injustice to them if I put a stranger on a par with them. Okay, so there we have, again, this idea of loving only those who are like me or like my ideal, or where likeness can be established, which implies the not loving of those who signify difference or who cannot be assimilated into my ideal of who I am. We had a remark back there.
Yeah, I just thought of how Derrida said, far from being the beginning of pure ethics, the neighbor as like is the ruin of such an ethics. There is any.
Say it again.
Yeah, it's far from being the beginning of pure ethics, the neighbor as like, the prochain comme semblable.
Yeah.
Or as resembling, as looking like, spells the end or the ruin of such an ethics. If
Yes.
there is any.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And the other thing that can perhaps help us to deepen our understanding of this passage is the way Lacan will take it for a victory lap, in a sense, because the utterance, love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, how well have you learned to love yourselves? With all that destructive jouissance and self-hatred and failure to really somehow embrace something like self and meet it. You really want to do that to your poor neighbor?
Yeah, really.
You know, that poor innocent neighbor?
Yeah.
So he ironizes this and still takes off from the profound reverberation that this will have for any possible ethics.
Yes. I mean, it's, the example of that, which I thought of, I guess, last night when Bronco was giving her talk, was that the situation of so many women who do not want to be mothers, or even men who do not want to be fathers, precisely because they don't want some kid to come from them. Right? Like, no, not from me, come from somewhere else, or, I don't want to pass this self on, right? And it's a serious moment, and it's a real one. And sometimes people overcome it and have children anyway, and then have to look at this kid who is the deformed image of the self, and they take it out on that kid. Anyway, there's some pretty intense things there, right? We can't just imagine that that's like a lovely, important love and loss.
And this is a very, as you know, we're now mostly, even if you haven't really spent years in the archives with Levinas, we are still inflected by the Levinasian signature and incursion, where Levinas places us in embrace with the stranger, right?
Yes.
So this sounds like something that we can't really admit or accept at this moment of our training, whether it's specifically Levinasian or not, that really or Hannah Arendt, who replaced the citizen with the refugee, that you have to welcome, right? So Freud seems to be saying, I don't think so. But beyond all of the beautiful teachings that we've been slapped around by and trained by to refine our sensibilities and openness and so on, and the Derridian unconditional hospitality, if that were possible, by the way. Derrida always adds, if this is possible. He's not interested in the possible, but in the impossible, which is where I think we're traveling now, on the edges of what's impossible, maybe. Beyond all of that, or before it, and by the way, Derrida reminds us that beyond the pleasure principle is not beyond. It is the pleasure principle. with an internal kind of sense of beyond itself, maybe. Not even internal, external, and so on. So, one can see this, nonetheless, so with all those precautionary remarks and trainings and all that, that there's a concern for some level of justice and fairness. Really, you're going to love some remote asshole? Sorry, that's not what he's saying. I'm exaggerating.
That's what he's saying.
Okay. When you've I don't know what the language would be, cultivated, learned, heard the voice of the introjected friend or so on. Is this even imaginable? And is it fair? Is it just to maybe run the risk of the abstraction of the one to whom love ought to be addressed? And you say, I love everyone. Oh, get out of my way, honey. You know?
Yeah.
Does that actually undermine your ability to, and I'm saying this in a so undeconstructed way, to truly give love? This would be one of my questions, because one knows of those types of radically universal embraces that mows you down as it's on its way to its, exalted.
Right, which is uninterested in you.
Exactly.
Right? I love everyone, I'm uninterested in you. I love everyone, I don't prefer you over anyone else. The way I love you is the exact same way I love everyone else. It's like, well, fuck you.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
I'm out of here.
That's what I'm
I'm outta
saying.
here.
Well, I didn't
I'm
say
outta
that enough, but.
No, it's like,
Yeah.
what? It's like, need something a little bit more than that.
Okay.
But,
You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
So is there a way even to, without smoothing over these terrible edges, to integrate these kind of shrapnels or fragments of that seem a little dissociated, and then start thinking in ethics, not a smooth running machine at all, but is there a way to somehow open up to something like a Christian love without the sacrifices that it implies and the hostility that it conceals and the aggression that it thinks it's suspended? Maybe these are your people.
Yeah.
So to me, this is this kind of the difference between Levinas and Freud hinges on exactly this, whether they can accept this alterity to a certain extent. Like for Freud, it's all within a psyche, and there's no opening there for the possibility of, say, like Levinas is infinite within the totality. So long as Freud closes that up and makes it all about the kind of ego and the subjectivity.
This is very important to start articulating this and offer a rendezvous for them, a blind date maybe. But this, I think, is Freud's critique too. This
Yes.
is
He can't accept that infinite, right? Like,
No, he wants it to happen, but he doesn't think we can do it. I would say provisionally, but I interrupted you. Because
Yeah.
that's his concern,
That is his
that one
concern.
takes the autistic lane and says, get out of my way. That's his concern, but that's not his wish.
Yeah.
He's wondering, can we have, and I'm paraphrasing, which means I'm distorting and warping. Can we have a just communitarity?
when I extract philosophy from Freud, it's almost like he's doing like the Nietzschean will to power within the self, and so long there's no telos in there, there's no goal, there can't be that absolute ethical command. It's excluded. It's just this drives and impulses, and we don't know what the source of it is and what grounds it, and if there is an absolute at all. For Freud, there is no, that fundamental principle is not there to supply, and that offering of the face that is other. So I'm reading that he can't have that in his system.
And that is, let me just make sure I get clear, that he cannot have in his system, if he has a system, I'm not sure he has a system, but the system that he has, Lex, tell me what that principle is exactly.
The embrace of an infinite within the finite, I guess, or a portal to another. Something that's not a part of this drive, sex drive, death drive.
I see.
Social.
Well, let me just say this briefly, which is that, remember, you know, that idea of the infinite that is opened up by the other, or that is understood as what the other signifies, that might be subject to the same critique as Christian love, in the sense that it's so general that it also evacuates the particularity of the other, right? Unless there's some way of working that out.
That's what Levinas' contribution is, isn't it? It's located in a fate, like we're talking generally, but it can be found in the person that I'm giving bread to, you know, in that interaction.
Possibly, but that's a big question of how we understand alterity there. But sorry, you wanted to.
No, I want you to go
Well,
ahead.
it's just here's the moment where I'm imagining Levinas listening to Freud. Okay, on 92 of this text, Freud is still worried about why it is that he should put the stranger on a par with those he knows and loves. Okay, so he's opening up our problem. He writes, not merely is this stranger in general unworthy of my love, I must honestly confess that he has more claim to my hostility and even my hatred. He seems not to have the least trace of love for me, and shows me not the slightest consideration. If it will do him any good, he has no hesitation in injuring me, nor does he ask himself whether the amount of advantage he gains bears any proportion to the extent of the harm he does to me. Indeed, he need not even obtain an advantage. If he can satisfy any sort of desire by it, he thinks nothing of jeering at me, insulting me, slandering me, and showing his superior power. And the more secure he feels, and the more helpless I am, the more certain I can expect him to behave like this to me. If he behaves differently, if he shows me consideration and forbearance as a stranger, I'm ready to treat him in the same way, in any case and quite apart from any precept. Indeed, if this grandiose commandment had run, love thy neighbor as thy neighbor loves thee, right? A reciprocity argument that Levinas would object to, I should not take exception to it. And there's a second commandment, which seems to me even more incomprehensible and arouses still stronger opposition in me. It is love thine enemies. If I think it over, however, I see that I'm wrong in treating it as a greater imposition. At bottom, it is the same thing. So, love thy neighbor as thyself is the same as love thine enemies. And then there's a beautiful little kind of splitting of the self that happens, which occasionally, it's the splitting of the voice, which happened earlier in the Rome chapter, where he writes, I think I can now hear a dignified voice admonishing me. Like, where is that coming from, darling? It is precisely, then this voice speaks, right? It is precisely because your neighbor is not worthy of love and is, on the contrary, your enemy, that you should love him as yourself. I then understand that the case is one like that of credo quia absurdum. Now, it is very probable that my neighbor, when he is enjoined to love me as himself, will answer exactly as I have done and will repel me for the same reasons. Okay, so first of all, there's a question that I would ask here, which is, what year is this written? Does anybody know?
29.
29.
I don't know which one.
I think it's, let's find out for sure.
German edition,
I think it's
1930.
Is it 1930?
English translation, 1930.
Okay. Yes, 30. It's exactly 10 years after Beyond the Pleasure Principle. That's correct. So, he's living in Europe. He's dealing with rising anti-Semitism. He is dealing with, he's between two wars. there's something of that historical register here that I think we have to just sort of see. And of course, the question that he's raising is a question that is raised of Levinas too. Why should I make the other into the ethical priority prior to myself? Why should I do that if the other will treat me badly, or if the other has no consideration for me? And Levinas's answer is really radically anti-ego-logical in the sense that he imagines an ethical bond to the other that really does exceed narcissistic investment. That it's broken out of the narcissistic circle. It's not worried about injury, and in fact, that binding moment is a persecution. You know, that's right. Of course, you're going to suffer at the hands of the other. That's correct. But that's also part of the bond that we have. That's not a reason not to make the bond. And Freud's over here. Is that humanly possible? I think it's a perfectly good question to ask of Levinas, by the way. Is that humanly possible? Like, who does that and how? And where is hostility? Is it not there? Is it banished? How does it work? Or is it internalized? Can we rule it out? Can we take it out of the picture fully? I think we've got a couple of questions. Yeah, please.
Well, I would say maybe to respond to Bella, you could see that transference, the concept of transference is a question of the other, right? How can you have a relation to the other that doesn't get immediately turned into the familiar? So there's a question there. I think that's all I wanted to say.
Well, a nice result of your question would be if someone wanted to write a dissertation on figure of the persecutor in Freud and in Levinas, and start
Yes.
thinking. You know, that's what you
Yes.
just pivoted your beautiful response on.
Yes.
And I don't know if you had all your ears on to what Judith Butler just said, but that would be the limit of that would be an abyss to clear, if it's possible, which is to say, yes, the other arrives kind of as a persecutory force that Levinas opens up to, and Freud momentarily folds to, if only it's to be a very momentary strategic retreat in order to take measure of the persecutory force of the other. These are questions he's asking at a very, very tragic historical end to his life and works. You know, the other thing to be said is that the dissociative qualities of the topologies and tropologies of the Freudian inquiry are something to consider when wanting to make him meet or have him meet Levinas, because he's not going to want to or be able to cover the whole field of intensities and residue and libidinal overdrive. This is why, note, and this is something that Badiou, for example, would never, never, never be able to or want to say. Note the way that Freud insists on not knowing, on approaching with the shakes and the trembling of someone who's tapping into places that are going to hurt. So there's a real sensitivity on both the works and parts of Levinas and Freud to what hurts. And that's what psychoanalysis, the question is, where does it hurt? And how do I deal with what Judith Butler called the defenselessness? That's primal, Hilflosigkeit. I'm helpless. What do I do with this other that's showing up? And really, really threatening. It could be just threatening in a beautiful way, like my beliefs, my so-called systems, my so-called being, and it might be a wonderful renaissance of which is always a little violent and so on and so forth. So I think it would be, rather than close off one or the other in their impossible communication, to maybe isolate one of the motifs that you brought up with great success and track them, like the persecutor in these texts that I want to look at, that exemplarily have known and met their frenemies.
Yeah, yeah.